Hello to everyone. Most people tell you all the time that it's very good and very beneficial to work with the stakeholders, and I agree. But still today I would like to explain to you why it is also difficult and what you have to have in mind when you talk with stakeholders. The basic point I would like to make is that all structural reforms not only have benefits, but they also have costs for some stakeholders. I will give you some examples later. So it means when you talk with stakeholders, they will discuss the reform you are proposing from their own point of view. So they will think, what's the benefit of the reform for our group, for me, and what is the cost? And if the cost is very high, or they're afraid that the cost will be high, they will try to oppose the reform. They will not be willing to support it. And the problem in this is if the interests or the voices of those stakeholders who will face costs prevail in the discussion, and then you adjust the reform or you back up too much, then you end up with the reform which produces maybe no costs for no one, but it's also not anymore the reform. Why are these costs there? Because the reform always changes the current situation, and so those who are in the best position in the current situation, they will have costs when you change the situation. Now, to give you some examples typical for the ERP reforms, market liberalization, for example, in energy and transport markets, it's not good for the big companies who are in the market now, because now they control the market, they make high profits. With competition, they will lose some of their position. It's also not good for the people who are working for these companies, because they may lose jobs if this company will become under strong competitiveness pressure. And very often with the liberalization, prices will also increase for the consumers. So market liberalization is good. It creates benefits in the long run, in the medium run, but it also creates costs for some groups. The same if you think about the labor market. For example, it's very common to tell people, okay, we will support you with unemployment benefits or social benefits, but you have to be active in searching for work. Now, when you do this, when you introduce such kind of measures, some people who before would be able to be on social assistance, let's say, indefinitely, all the time, will not have this possibility anymore, so they will have a cost. They will need to adjust. Maybe it will be good for them. They will find jobs. This is the intention. But still, they will face costs. And the same if you think of reducing the informal economy. Today, some people maybe could not find jobs in the formal economy. So if from today until tomorrow there is no more informal economy, there will be people who will find it very hard to create income for them or to earn income. And there will also be businesses who will probably find it very hard to work under the conditions and under the costs of the formal economy. So they will try to avoid the measures or even oppose the reform if possible. The question is, of course, now what you can do if those who will face costs and you think the reform is okay, it has to be done, but some people or groups will face costs. What can you do? Of course, you can try to compensate them for these costs. There are two ways of compensation. One is direct payment, which means that you cover part of the costs of the reform for these groups from the budget. And another approach is to adjust the reform, make it more gradual, for example, or to introduce some additional measures to deal with these costs. Now, to give you again an example so that you know what I'm talking about, if, for example, the prices of electricity will go up when you liberalize the market, you can introduce some subsidy for energy prices for the vulnerable households or households with lower income. You can also maybe think of giving some kind of a subsidy to the companies for restructuring so that they can adapt to the competition. But it's difficult to do in a way that will really force them to restructure so that they don't just spend the money that you have given them and that they still go down and they don't restructure. But it's a possibility. So this is like a complementary measure. Now, if you think, you can also do a complementary measure in the sense that you introduce specific labor market measures for those people who will lose jobs in the current big players in the market, retrain them, trying to find them jobs somewhere else. You can think in similar way when you're trying to reduce the informal economy. For example, a lot of countries use a tax allowance or a subsidy for businesses who employ people formally who were before employed informally, to reduce, at least for a time, this cost of changing from informal to formal employment. Or maybe in the activation measure, this measure where you tell people, oh, now you have to search for work and take the work if there is work or a job, or otherwise you will not receive unemployment benefits anymore. You can think of doing it gradually, not introduce the whole punishment immediately. And you can also think that, for some really vulnerable groups, you don't do it, because if you know that it's really objectively hard for someone like, handicapped people, people with disabilities, to find jobs, then maybe you don't introduce this kind of punishment for them. Now, what is the difficulty? It sounds good. You have a reform which will create benefits, so you may compensate some people, if you want. There are two limits to this logic. One logic is that this monetary compensations cost. So there will be a cost for the budget, which may be sometimes even as high as the cost of the reform, And the other thing is, if you adjust the measure too much, you go too gradual, you listen to too many people, then maybe you are left with no reform at the end, or no effective reform at the end, because you have adjusted it too much. You have backed up, from too many things when you were adjusting the reform to what everyone said is maybe problematic for them. So you have to be careful. There is a limit on this, how much you can compensate. So if you cannot compensate everyone, and you want to have the reform because you think it's good, then how do you square these two things? On one hand, you want to maybe help, with these costs. On the other hand, you still want to have a good reform. Now, what happens then? What does it mean when you talk for your consultations with stakeholders? It means that very often they will turn into some kind of negotiations, where you will come and you will say, well, this reform is great, and you will talk about the benefits of the reform, what it will bring good. And then many stakeholders will come and they will talk about the cost. And what is important, they will exaggerate the costs. So they will be realistic. They will tell you about the costs which will be there. But for example, a big company which is about to face stronger competition, they may be on their calculations, maybe they will lose 10% of the market, but they will come to you and they will tell you we will lose a third of the market and we'll have to fire 1,000 or 10,000 people just to make you a little bit scared and to adjust your reform. So you have to realistically assess somehow, or simply just know that stakeholders, some of them, will always exaggerate the cost, and they will not talk about the benefits that maybe the reform also has for them, which means that, and it also goes for not only for business stakeholders, it also goes for the NGOs, for example, trade unions. They may also exaggerate, the number of people who will really be hurt, or which groups are really vulnerable, the example of the activation measure, or how many people will not be able to work in the formal economy, and so on. So you have to know this, and then still in these negotiations you will try to find a balance maybe with going somewhere towards compensating these costs, but still keeping the reform meaningful and effective. Now, what is important here is that you also have other types of stakeholders, of course. You have those who will benefit from the reform. The new companies that will come to the market and may grow. The existing companies which actually today face unfair competition from informal economy, so they will support the formal economy. In my experience, unfortunately, it is usually so that those who are hurt, or they think they will be hurt, they are louder. They get more attention in the media. And those who think, well, this is a good reform, they will not be so loud. They will think, well, it's government business to do it, you know? So you have to try and speak with them and ask them for support also when you have meetings with other stakeholders. You know, if somebody comes up and says, well, this is not good for me, then one other stakeholder should speak up as well and say, but we think this is good for this and these reasons. It helps you balance and it helps you go forward.